This is called Celebrate Genocide, No Thanks. It is by Richard Santiago. On November 24th, many in the United States gathered with their families to feast in unintentional celebration of the worst genocide in human history. Taught from childhood that the friendly pilgrims invited the Indians to a great feast after surviving their first year in New England, little do most of them know that the real history of Thanksgiving is a story of mass murder and theft. For the entire story, we could go back to the first landing of Columbus in what is now the Dominican Republic in 1492. But being as though that is outside the scope of this article, we'll focus on the events in North America that led to the creation of the modern-day Thanksgiving. In 1614, a small group of English explorers sailed home from North America with a ship full of Pattatucks Indians that were to be used as slaves. Those who escaped capture were virtually wiped out by the smallpox they had left behind. One of the original colonists would later describe the mass death as a gift from God, writing, "But for the natives in these parts, God hath so pursued them as for 300 miles space, the greatest part of them are swept away by smallpox, which still continues among them, so as God hath thereby cleared our title to this place." By the time the group of religious zealots called Puritans arrived in Massachusetts Bay 4 years later, they found only one Paxatuck survivor, a man named Squanto, who had survived slavery in Europe and spoke the colonists' language. He taught them how to plant corn and catch fish and helped negotiate a peace treaty with the nearby Wampanoag Nation. This enabled the Puritans to survive their first year in North America. Quite a feat considering that previous settlements like those in Virginia had been completely wiped out in a few months' time. At the end of the year, they had held a great feast honoring Squanto and the Wampanoags. As word spread throughout England about the paradise to the west, religious exiles began heading to the New World by the boatload. They began discussing who exactly owned the land that they had settled on. This method of farming was based on individual ownership, as opposed to the Indians who practiced communal farming, and to whom land ownership was a completely alien idea. A few of the Puritans argued that even though the land had been inhabited by Indians, they were soon expelled from the settlements. Governor Winthrop of Massachusetts declared that since the Indians had not fenced in and cultivated all the land, it was public domain, under which the English common law meant that it belonged to the king. So then, it was decided that the local governor, not the Indians, would decide what would be done with the land. The settlers joined up in groups and seized vast stretches of land, captured strong young natives for slaves to work it, and killed old men, women, and children for whom they had no use. The Pattatuck Nation, who had never argued to the peace treaty negotiated by Squanto, fought back. The war between the Pequot and English would be one of the bloodiest in North America. In 1637, over 700 men, women, and children gathered near present-day Rockton, Connecticut, to celebrate their annual Green Corn Festival. Very early that morning, they were surrounded by English and Dutch mercenaries who ordered them to come outside. Those who did were shot or beaten to death, while the terror-stricken women and children who hid inside the longhouse were burned alive. The governor of Plymouth wrote about the events. Those that escaped the fire were slain with the sword. Some hewed to pieces, others ran through with their rapiers, so that they were quickly dispatched and few escaped. It was conceived they thus destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire. Horrible was the stink and scent thereof. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the prayers thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them. The next day, the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony declared a day of thanksgiving for the massacre. From then on, the colonists waged a vicious campaign against the Indians, attacking village after village. Women and children over 14 were captured and sold into slavery, while the others were murdered. Boats full of human cargo regularly shipped out from the ports of New England. After discovering just how profitable the slave trade could be, the burgeoning capitalists would go on to enslave millions of Africans and Asians. Scalp bounties were offered for Indian scalps by the local governments to encourage as many murders as possible. Another day of Thanksgiving was proclaimed in the churches of Manhattan after a mercenary hired by the governor set a village of hundreds of Indians on fire near what is now Stamford, Connecticut. The killings continued to increase, and the Day of Thanksgiving feasts were held after each successful slaughter. After a few years, there were almost no Indians left in the northern English colonies. George Washington finally suggested that one day of Thanksgiving be held per year, instead of this celebrating each bloodbath individually. Later, President Lincoln would declare Thanksgiving Day to be a legal holiday during the Civil War. Since the first landing of Europeans in the Americas, hundreds of millions of human beings have been killed. Thanksgiving has been celebrated annually in the United States since 1863. The state of Massachusetts invited Wamsutta of the Wampanoag to give a speech during their 350th anniversary celebration of Thanksgiving in 1970. However, when the planners reviewed his speech beforehand, they wouldn't allow it, and instead wrote an alternative speech. Wamsutta refused to give the speech written by the planners and instead to protest the continued silencing of the American Indians. He and his supporters went to neighboring Coles Hill. Overlooking the Plymouth Harbor and the Mayflower replica, Wamsutta gave his original speech. In it he said, "Today is a time of celebrating for you, a time of looking back to the first days of white people in America. But it is not a time of celebrating for me. It is with heavy heart that I look back upon what happened to my people. When the Pilgrims arrived, we, the Wampanoags, welcomed them with open arms, little knowing that it was the beginning of the end. That before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoag would no longer be a tribe. That we and other Indians living near the settlers would be killed by their guns or dead from diseases that we caught from them. History wants us to believe that the Indian was a savage, illiterate, uncivilized animal. A history that was written by an organized, disciplined people to expose us as an unorganized and undisciplined entity. Two distinctly different cultures met. One thought they must control life, the other believed life was to be enjoyed, because nature decreed it. So let us remember, the Indian is and was just as human as the white man. This marked the first National Day of Mourning. The few American Indians that survived the 500-year genocide are the poorest ethnic group in the richest country in the world. Each year, they, along with supporters of all shades, gather at Plymouth Rock on Thanksgiving Day for a day of mourning, during which they fast, remember what is lost, and protest against continued racism and injustice. Some ask, will you ever stop protesting, said Moonanum James in a speech on the 29th National Day of Mourning in 1998. Someday we will stop protesting. We will stop protesting when the merchants of Plymouth are no longer making millions of dollars off the blood of our slaughtered ancestors. We will stop protesting when we can act as a sovereign nation on our own land without the interference of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and what Sitting Bull called the favorite ration chiefs. When corporations stop polluting our mother, the earth, when racism has been eradicated, when the oppression of two-spirited people is a thing of the past, we will stop protesting when homeless people have homes and no child goes to bed hungry. When the police brutality no longer exists in communities of color. We will stop protesting when Leonard Peltier and Muma Abdul-Jamal and the Puerto Rican independents and all the political prisoners are free. Until then, the struggle will continue.